introduction, and then we'll pass it over to the panelists to introduce their contributions. So on Tuesday of this week, in his inaugural memo as newly elected chair of the Democratic National Committee, or DNC, Ken Martin was candid in his diagnosis. Quote, "When I talk about the state of the Democratic Party," he wrote, "I often speak about the impact of perceptions, what voters see, feel, and sense. I believe the canary in the coal mine for what happened on November 5 was the recent showing that for the first time in modern history, Americans now see the Republicans as the party of the working class and the Democrats as the party of the elites." And then he continued, "We have to take seriously the job of repairing and restoring the perceptions of our party and our brand. It's time to remind working Americans and also show them every day the Democratic Party always has been and always will be the party of the worker." End quote. But is this just a matter of mistaken perceptions? And is the work of repair just a matter of rebranding? In Mastery and Drift, a new volume edited by historians Brent, Cebul, and Geismer, the contributors suggest that the matter runs far deeper. On their collective read, the fate of the contemporary Democratic Party and the broader web of institutions in which it's embedded is tied up in a much longer term and more fundamental emergence and transformation of what they call professional class liberalism since the 1960s. Of course, exploration or talk of this development isn't new. The American right has long crowed about the overweening influence of liberal elites for several decades. And in the wake of the defeat of the Clinton campaign in 2016, many intellectuals on the left revived a 70s era analysis of so-called professional managerial class as a critique of the democratic establishment. Mastery and Drift, however, which explicitly nods to Walter Lippmann's seminal treatise on American liberalism, first published in 1914, avoids such polemics in favor of a longer and more searching historical perspective. So there are 15 chapters, and across them, the different authors explore areas as diverse as philanthropy, consulting, healthcare, welfare, race, immigration, economics, and foreign policy. And across all of these domains, they contend we can distinguish two major trends from the 1960s. One is the rising prominence of a new generation of professional class liberals, lawyers, economists, policy experts, nonprofit executives, pollsters, political consultants, and more, driven by especially the major expansion of graduate and professional education over this period. And the second is the emergence of a distinctive form of liberal governance, the fetishism of expertise and pragmatism, a kind of techno-optimism, abiding faith in data-driven policy, and as the editors put it, a quote, "deep satisfaction at finding sophisticated and for citizens difficult to comprehend legal and technical policy fixes," end quote. So this is a markedly technocratic imaginary of governance, one that suited the sensibilities and maybe even the interests of this new professional class. But it's also one that broke markedly with the sweeping and sometimes structural reforms of earlier generations of American liberalism. And one that's arguably appeared increasingly exhausted and inadequate in the face of the overlapping crises engulfing us today. So as these histories suggest, our understanding of the origins and development of ideas like neoliberalism can't be simply understood through the ideas and actions of a few activist scholars at the University of Chicago or members of the Mont Pelerin Society. Its contours have to be situated in a broader sociological transformation in American political life. So why this volume now? Within the American historical profession, much attention in the last few decades has been devoted to the rise of American conservatism, its distinctive roots, its singular success, particularly since the 1980s. And certainly the policy priorities of this current administration, despite all its populist rhetoric, and for instance, its trenchant attacks on the administrative state, suggest that history remains vitally important for making sense of our present. But as the authors of this volume submit, the obverse of this conservative rise is the civic disembedding of American liberalism and its circumscription to a large, if demographically narrow, slice of elite professionals. And so from this perspective, maybe another PR rebranding exercise of the Democratic Party might not be fully adequate to the task. Historians don't like making predictions, but at the very least, the impact of the seismic developments charted in the volume are sure to define a terrain of struggle for the foreseeable future. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to the panelists. First, we'll start with the editors, Lily and Brent, who are going to introduce their introduction and the sort of purposes of the volume. And then we'll have each of the three contributors talk about their individual chapters. So maybe Brent and Lily, if you'll start.
Sure, and I'll start, and I'll just say thank you so much, Simon, for that really wonderful introduction, and we're so grateful to Simon and the Boston Review for hosting this event. We admire them so tremendously and are really grateful to our panelists and also to everyone in the audience for coming on what I hear on the East Coast is a very cold Thursday night, and for us on the West Coast, a pleasant Thursday afternoon. So I wanted to I will say first of all, I apologize. My son just came in because I had a babysitting issue and he overheard someone say the 20th century and he was like, but that was so long ago. So I think there's a question of the fact that like we as historians tend to not actually historicize this period very much, or it's seen as not history, but it speaks to how long ago it actually was in the mind of an 8.5-year-old. But for many people, including our own students, and the need to sort of historicize this period. I was going to sort of talk a bit about sort of why we decided to do this volume, and begin with that, and then Brent can sort of talk about some of the themes, and then we'll turn it over to the panelists. But this volume in many ways emerges from a conversation from over a decade ago when I was an assistant professor and Brent was I think still in grad school, and invited me and our other friend Mason Williams to a coffee shop to say like, I want to understand liberalism. And so we were parsing it out, and then we actually what emerged from that conversation was our writing another volume, which was shaped by the state, where we sort of questions of liberalism were on the back or sort of at the back end, but I think that the actual question of like how to understand liberalism very much still lingered. And I think that one of the things we sort of shared a consternation about, and this is something that I think Brett and I there are aspects of this question of like how to understand liberalism that we've both explored in our separate works in different ways. But the thing that we were sort of really struggling to sort of think through was to paraphrase a line from the book, which I will credit Brent wrote, which was that liberalism had become increasingly sort of since the 1960s, culturally omnipresent and politically wane. And while we were thinking about Americans support key liberal causes and social aspirations, the liberal approach to policy has actually been substantially less popular and less effective, which we've seen probably most prominently in the last election. And in some ways, to us, this question of sort of how to understand this sort of tension is actually a generational one. That the two of us are literally the same age, but many people in this volume are people who are part of the volume are people around the same cohort who came of age both politically and intellectually after the Cold War had ended, and during the presidencies of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, which sort of sets us in a different place than many of our predecessors who've looked at kind of political history. And we had, growing up in this moment, or coming of age in this moment, have come to understand sort of firsthand the possibilities and limitations of liberal approaches to policymaking and political strategy, and also experienced the war on terror and especially widening inequality, fueled by this reorientation of the national economy towards real estate, global finance, and the service economy. And these were all things that have been advocated by liberal administrations. So thinking about these developments led us to this question of kind of what has been the influence of professional class liberalism. And clearly, and this is something that I've explored in other works, we've seen the sort of electoral reorientation of the Democratic Party towards this kind of more professional class base. But we also want to understand what that means in terms of government. And so we began to think about kind of how, as Simon had brought up, graduate and professional training, particularly in areas like law and business, came to create new forms of technocracy that further narrowed liberal social aspirations. And one of our goals for this volume is not probably as clear from it's not meant to be an apology or champion for liberalism in its professional class form or even in its predecessors. In fact, we suggest that actually our generational positionality gives us a kind of analytical and critical detachment from liberalism, and so our investment in it is not sort of the same. But we want to be really careful and not simply dismissing this as neoliberalism, as often happens. We were directly influenced by a lot of the literature on a discussion around neoliberalism, especially as it emerged over the last decade. But one thing we thought was really missing from that was that it had not really fully grasped with the kind of self-conception of professional class liberals, meaning like they don't call themselves neoliberal, and that's not a term they use to describe their worldview. And we really wanted to kind of understand how they conceived of themselves as kind of carrying on a much forward a liberal or progressive tradition, and take that seriously to sort of think through their politics, and as well as their understanding of governance. So I'm going to turn it over to Brent now to kind of talk more about certain aspects of the other parts of the argument.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to add my thank yous to Jasmine and Simon, and especially to not just the three authors here, but the other 12 that contributed wonderful chapters and trusted us with their work. So thank you all. And so to this point that I think Simon gestured at, that Lily gestured at, I think we're really committed to this idea that the role of government, of governance, is sort of a central theme of liberalism. And in part, I think this is because, as we kind of lay out in the introduction, over the course of the 20th century, liberalism as a political ideology, which we think of as coming from the 19th century, is trying to sort of balance individualism and laissez-faire economics, which doesn't often, necessarily go together. The state can be sort of the flywheel between these things, balancing them. That the state becomes the sort of proving ground for liberalism as an ideology, and its central venue for where you're going to sort of work out what liberalism means as a political project, whether it's stimulating the economy to create opportunity, securing various forms of equality for formerly marginalized groups, but toggling between market and individual opportunity, I think, is sort of foundational to how we think about liberalism. And as Simon mentioned, our title harkens back to Lippmann's 1914 book, Drift and Mastery. And Lippmann is very much sort of at the beginning point of this emergent version of liberalism, right? And his thoughts, in the Gilded Age and progressive era, when laissez-faire and individualism are clashing, is that democracy, such as it was at that point, just didn't have the stuff to solve, the social drift that he saw, the political and economic corruption, these massive corporations, these boom and bust economic cycles. And so what he called for was public and private rule or governance by scientific technocratic elites, right? Professionally trained, socially enlightened, rational experts, who could plan, they could forecast, they could manage these unruly forces that had sort of set society adrift, right? He's not calling for democracy, full-throatedly here, right? What he's calling for is sort of technical experts are going to manage the economy and govern in ways that have sort of democratic outcomes, right? They might, level the playing field a little bit. They might create some social goods, but we're not talking about sort of mass democratic participation here, right? We really need, socially minded, rational experts at the helm. And so these technical experts, right, these technocrats become a really important articulator of liberal governance across the 20th century, from the New Deal through the Great Society and up into the 20th century. And so where the chapters really take off, and the themes sort of begin to coalesce, is in the 60s and 70s, right? When we have really two major dynamics that I think almost every chapter in some way is grappling with, right? And the first is the sort of social unrest of those decades in the 60s and 70s over civil rights, Vietnam, state repression of radical movements, and also these expanding claims to welfare rights, affirmative action, the Equal Rights Amendment, guaranteed income, LGBTQ rights, disability rights. All of these are emerging at a moment of profound economic and fiscal crises for government, to do with the industrialization, globalization, and inflation. And so it seemed as though the US government didn't have the resources to meet these exploding demands, right? And these are demands that all fit under the rubric or umbrella of liberalism, of liberal rights, right? And so in some ways, this is like the technocrats' moment. Like, how are you going to deal with the constraints? How are you going to reorganize the state in a certain way that can deliver, approximations of these rights claims that all these groups are making, but in ways that don't necessarily, reflect the sort of more radical mass populist movements, the more fundamental critiques of the state, the more fundamental critiques of capitalism, that some of those movements were making, right? And so it's at this moment then that you have this exploding ranks of professionally trained graduates of schools that, as Simon mentioned, of economics, the law, public policy, public administration, social work, communications, on and on and on, right? Moving into the state, moving into philanthropies, public interest law shops, working for government contractors, social service agencies, right? And for a lot of these folks, I think it's important, as Lily mentioned, to remember the self-conception, right? They agree in many respects with the rights claims that many of these groups are making, but they want to do it sort of incrementally. They want to do it within the system. They're willing to sort of accept the certain constraints and figure out ways to do it, right? And so really what these chapters in the volume are about is how liberalism evolved as its energies were directed through these constraints, right? And tried to sort of meet these movements and these claims within capitalism and through the state, right? And so from one angle, I think many of the chapters can be read for their accounts of like the technical wizardry going on here, right? Really remarkably ingenious and complex regulatory and fiscal and financial efforts in the face of really notable political and other constraints to create disability rights in Karen Tani's chapter, or Obamacare, as Nikki gestures at in hers. But I think we also really want to emphasize the class blindness and the class-based and sort of social insulation from other Americans that happens, because what's happening here is not only as these professional class liberals are moving into the state, they're also moving into the media, they're moving into universities, they're moving into, you know, all sorts of institutions that they sort of view as the towering heights of the culture and society. And so they have their views reflected back to them in ways that, as Simon mentioned, speeds along the sort of more popular disembedding of liberalism as a meaningful social and civic force in places beyond the life worlds of these professional class liberals. And so part of what we want to suggest is that this emphasis on technical mastery, this proceduralism, institutional norms, incremental change, right? It has a certain value, right? But if that becomes the totality of your political vision, if that becomes the totality of your social ideas, as it seems increasingly clear today, it's going to leave liberals and liberalism sort of singularly unable to meet particular sets of challenges that we may be facing in this contemporary moment. So I'll stop there and let Simon sort of tee up our panelists, who I really want to hear more from than us. So thank you.
Yeah, so we're very lucky to have 3 of the authors. So I'm each going to give them about 3 minutes, a short amount of time to summarize their contributions or just talk about it. I think we're going to start with Danielle.
Yeah. Thank you, Simon, and everyone who showed up to watch this today. So I kind of engage these questions from what might be a surprising or unusual place, which was a series of mass Black family reunions that were organized by Dorothy Height of the National Council of Negro Women in the 1980s and 1990s. And they were intended to kind of spark a renewal of traditional family values during this period where there was a revival of concern about the breakdown of the Black family, which of course is not a new concern in the 1980s or 1990s. And these reunions, they were organized by Height, but they were funded by corporations, including Procter & Gamble, which was the founding partner. Eventually, as they spread across the country, partners like Anheuser-Busch and Coors and IBM would kind of fund these family reunions. So I use these seemingly kind of conservative family reunions as a lens through which to trace a distinctly Black liberal path to neoliberalism. So in the chapters, I'm suggesting that the reunions and kind of the broader turn to self-help that they represented illustrated not necessarily a rise of a neoconservatism or conservatism or an acquiescence to neoliberalism, as people have kind of suggested more recently, but rather they're illustrating a return to an established strategy of Black endurance that was crafted in response to a long history of public abandonment of Black communities. And because Black folks could often not rely on the state to provide an adequate social safety net, Black welfare was administered through the Black private sector, through Black private institutions like neighborhood nonprofits, churches, mutual aid groups, civil rights, and most fundamentally of those private groups, the Black family. And so all the talk of self-help and family values in Black liberal circles in the 1980s is, I suggest it's not really a deviation from this kind of progressive, more authentic Black liberal politics, but rather it's a resurgence of this foundational approach to survival that happens to intersect with both conservative rhetoric and emergent neoliberal strategies of social welfare, which devolve responsibility for care down to the individual, families, and then to the private sector. But even though Black liberals in the 1980s were overlapping and dovetailing programmatically with professional class liberals, the same professional class liberals that are discussed in other chapters of the volume, they're arriving at the same neoliberal destination on a very different path. So their embrace of these private sector-based solutions and market-based solutions, it's grounded in this long-held skepticism of the state, of the public sector, that was rooted in a very necessary recognition of the limits of liberalism and the harms of the liberal state more broadly. And we'll probably return to that idea later. But yeah, this chapter is kind of thinking about how Black liberalism sort of reveals different insights into this question of neoliberalism and kind of reveals the limits of liberalism itself.
Thanks so much. Great. Okay, and then we'll move to Dylan.
All right. Thank you all for attending. Thank you guys for being here. This chapter started with a sandwich in a park. Brent, a few years ago, we were eating outside. I guess COVID was in order. And he said, Dylan, over a bite of a sandwich, you need to do the liberal media. Find out what it is. Does it exist? Anatomize it, put it on the table, cut it open. And that was a great provocation because I had no idea what he was talking about. Is there a liberal media? Is this just an epithet from the right? This is a live question. And I thought, well, has anyone written this history? And indeed, they hadn't. In 2016, there were all these struggle sessions about the journalists who'd missed Trump's rise, right? Had the media, why hadn't they talked to enough people in diners in the Midwest, right? Had they become too cloistered geographically, too educated, too metropolitan, too elite, ultimately, to understand the broader currents of American life? And what I found ultimately is that those critiques did, in fact, have a ring of truth. That if you look at the historical evolution of media over the 20th century, going all the way back to the kind of Fordist 1930s through the internet of Wired and Salon.com, there is a story about the abandonment of working class audiences, labor as a central topic in American life, a broad-based vision for transformative participatory politics that's movement-based rather than the terrain of technocratic, highly educated elites. And the stat that really got me going down this road was I found out that the masthead of the New Republic has more Ivy League grads than the US Senate or the C-suite of the Fortune 500. I think that is a wild stat, right? Meanwhile, the masthead of the New York Times in the 40s and 50s was only like half college educated, even less. Editors didn't want college educated people. They wanted ink-stained workers who could be trained in this kind of apprenticeship model and work their way up. It was truly a union of craft workers, literally ink-stained, and the reporters upstairs. But that began to change after the 1960s as the metropolitan newspaper begins chasing ever more elite audiences, whether they're in the suburbs or they're urban professionals in a small number of gentrifying neighborhoods around the country. And as newspapers pivot to this new lifestyle coverage to target and kind of gratify those professionals, they actually pull out of unprofitable minority neighborhoods. The LA Times stops printing in Spanish. The Washington Post stops distributing in Black neighborhoods. And with the rejection of that audience and the pivot to an upscale audience in an age of increasing inequality, we see the tenor of the coverage shift as the newsroom itself shifts, becoming more college educated all the time. Now, I can't possibly sketch the whole 20th century, but I wanted to highlight one really emblematic moment that speaks to this. 1994, the newspapers go on strike in San Francisco, the Examiner and the Chronicle. The Teamsters are upset about the contract. The reporters go out and strike with them. But news is still happening. So they create a website, the Free Press, actually using the Whole Earth electronic link, the Whole Earth catalog legacy. There's a counterculture story there. And they publish news, the first online news. And they say, wait a second, we don't need the craft workers. We don't need the union guys downstairs or the expensive investment in capital infrastructure. We can get the news out directly to our highly educated audience. All those alums of the Chronicle found Salon.com the next year. They call themselves militantly centrist. And theirs is a new style of political savvy coverage that offers readers a kind of peek behind the curtain of how the real operators do things in DC or New York or Hollywood for that matter. And there's a sort of unsentimental expertise of intellectual swordplay where takes and counterintuitiveness are more important ultimately than political efficacy. I hate to pick on, well, I don't hate to pick on Matthew Iglesias, but he's the embodiment of this type, right? The highly educated technocratic solution that can hit a home run if only people can understand the complexity of the tax code the way he does. Now, you might be asking what happened to the blue collar lumpen left out of this? Well, this is where Rupert Murdoch and similar kind of culturally blue collar outlets swoop in and say, hey, we've got an outlet for you that speaks in your language. It attacks elites, but not economic elites, the supercilious cultural elites who have rejected you, who have retreated to their magazines that don't really pay attention to your issues anymore. And that's where you get a kind of journalistic bifurcation that echoes and it helps to create ultimately the partisan split we see today with a sort of cultural elite that is in fact cloistered, increasingly geographically concentrated, somewhat diverse, but only in limited ways, if you want to talk about newsrooms, and a kind of blue collar cultural orientation that doesn't hew just to economic class, but to an orientation around hard work, masculinity, and anti-liberalism, which I hope we'll talk about later. So it's a long story. It's going to become a book. Watch this space. But I'm excited to share more.
Thanks. And then finally, Nikki.
Thank you again so much for having all of us. My story chapter did not start with a sandwich, unfortunately, but it did start with the cover of Time magazine right after Barack Obama's election. Some of you may remember this cover because it was this iconic photograph of FDR in the back of a car with a cigarette on a cigarette holder. And Time had imposed over that Barack Obama's face. And the headline read, "A New Deal," because Obama was coming into office in the middle of this financial crisis, this global collapse of the economy. And people were looking around and they were thinking, like, maybe the age of big government is back. And so when I was starting this essay on Barack Obama and professional class liberals, I was thinking about that image and that promise at the beginning of the Obama administration and how thinking about what was possible was very much conditioned by the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt, and also by the Great Society and Lyndon Johnson. Barack Obama is coming in with big majorities in both the Senate and in the House, and there was a real sense of possibility of not just bringing the country out of the crisis, but building something new on top of it, that the sort of exhaustion of conservatism over the past 30 years had led us to this possible new flowering of liberalism. That's not what we got. And I was trying to wrestle with why the outcomes and even really the vision of the Obama administration turned out the way that it did. And I'm just going to touch on 3 points about that. One, I think that I'll focus on most is Barack Obama himself, his ideological commitment to bipartisanship. He was also quite committed to technocratic governance, again, not new in the 2000s and 2010s, but comes out in a particular way for the Obama administration. And then finally, the techno-optimism of the Obama administration. So thinking about bipartisanship, I mean, bipartisanship is something that politicians still today talk about as a positive good, in part because it's good branding. Americans like bipartisanship, in part because it's necessary strategy. Sometimes you need some of those Republican votes to get Democratic policies through. But I think that for Barack Obama, bipartisanship was an ideological commitment, that he believed that legislation was inherently better if it had Republican and Democratic authors, if it won Republican and Democratic votes, that was better than partisan legislation. And that commitment not only led him down the rabbit hole of pursuing Republican votes that weren't to be had, but it also led to the development of a kind of half-a-loaf liberalism, where Obama would come to the table already having sacrificed half of the liberal vision in order to entice Republicans to the table. I think the ACA is an excellent example of this, right? It's a Republican scheme for healthcare reform that is the starting point for the negotiations. And that meant that when the negotiations were ongoing, ultimately only within the Democratic Party, that they were starting from this very cramped vision of what healthcare reform might look like. And I think that that was true of much of the legislative vision coming out of the Obama administration because of that commitment to bipartisanship. I think the commitment to technocratic governance was also about limiting vision in a really important way. There was this belief throughout the administration that the best kind of agency action, the best kind of legislation was data-driven. If you go through the reports of the Obama administration, data-driven is papered over everything. And data isn't stories, right? Data isn't necessarily ethical. It's not necessarily a moral vision. But this was what the administration was leaning on. What do the numbers say? How can we sell this through data? And how can we construct an expert-driven government? So it's in this kind of passionless place, which is at odds, I think, with the public image of Barack Obama as a soaring rhetorician, somebody who was able to sell this big, beautiful, emotional vision of hope. But I think in terms of governance, that technocratic vision won out. And then finally, I'll just mention the techno-optimism. Don't have to belabor the point that that moment is very much over. But you know, the Obama campaign was hiring Chris Hughes from Facebook in 2008. They were teaming up with Apple and with Google with a belief that technology would lead to better policy and that teaming up with the tech industry would ultimately lead to good outcomes because the tech industry was also invested in making life better for the American people. Here we are. So I will leave it there, but that's kind of an overview of the chapter.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions of the panel, but we also want to hear from the audience. So while I talk or while we all talk, feel free to put questions in the Q&A box and we'll see them, and we'll reserve some time at the end for those. So just to start off with, and this is to anyone in the panel who wants to, feel so moved. So both the introduction and many contributions in the book compare this post-60s professional class liberalism to earlier forms of liberalism. So whether it's late 19th century African-American ideas of racial uplift, whether it's progressive era liberalism and corporate liberalism, whether it's Cold War liberalism of the mid-century. So I guess my question to anyone here is, what is distinctive about this post-60s moment? Like, what is new versus, what is old? And yeah, feel free, anyone can jump in.
I might just take a quick stab. And that is, I think one of the things that historians have focused on recently is pulling out the connections between what was happening in the 50s and 60s and what comes after. So Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor talks about how a lot of the sort of formula for neoliberal housing was built into the Great Society, what we think of as this triumphant moment of liberalism. But what I found in both this book and in my own work is that it's so much smaller, this liberalism that comes after the 1960s. The visions are smaller, the ideas of state capacity are smaller, and that leads to not necessarily inherently to neoliberalism, but the liberalism that remains seems to me to be very cramped in terms of its goals and its vision.
I'll just add a quick addendum to that point. I think that's exactly right, that the visions are smaller, but it's also the case that the state is so much bigger. The population of the country is so much bigger. The spatially, the range of projects that the state is carrying out are much larger, and that begs for a certain degree of expertise, right? And so I think while we can point to the role of lawyers in FDR's Brains Trust, right? They were, working at the beginning of the growth of the state. And I think one of the biggest constraints that professional class liberals are working under is the nature of the state itself, the path dependency, the agencies, all of this stuff, right? And so when Lily mentioned at the start, this desire to really take at face value, the complexity and the self-conception of sort of doing good, I think that really matters. But I also think it really matters how that intention is being articulated, right? And in many cases being articulated through economics, through the law, through the sorts of incremental, highly technical, very specific types of knowledge that are required to do a lot of this big state work, right? And so on some level, I think, what's missing is, to go to Nikki's point about Obama, that sort of moral vision that can galvanize and call for a reorganizing of the state in macro terms and not just these sort of micro terms as well.
I'll just add one thing. I think another, I mean, to briefly build on the point. I mean, I think there's also this way of the technocratic and sort of making it small also has to do with the ways of like rebuilding the coalition, like the sort of liberal left coalition. And I think there's a great chapter in the book by Julie Kohler-Hausman about like the rise of kind of experts of pollsters and other kinds of like voting experts of like sculpting out the electorate, and this way that actually does shape of like who matters and doesn't matter in terms of like who's part of a coalition, that hugely shapes kind of liberalism after the 1960s and does contribute politically, electorally and politically to this professional class orientation as well. And I think the other part you see is also the like nostalgic that there was like this great moment of like sort of, the Democrat liberal dominated by the left. But I do think you see this is a period where you see a real kind of divorce of a lot of the kind of more left organizations and in many ways aspirations that defined other moments of the liberal project, particularly the New Deal. So especially the kind of, and I think Dylan really does expertly map this out, but a kind of a lack of real concern about the meanings of organized labor.
And to that point, there is a quality though of a post New Left liberalism. It has been injected with a form of skepticism about the state and its kind of overweening power. That it's also directed at labor unions and large corporations. Nader is a perfect example of this, right? It's this rejection of large institutions that are totalizing domination. It's very much of the New Left, but stripped of its radical left politics. So it's an orientation that can just be expressed culturally towards alienating institutions and stultifying jobs, or government that's oppressive and inefficient. And who's the hero? It's a new type of protagonist, a technocrat who can cut through the sclerotic institutions and produce change, to declare on the stump the New Deal is over, the New Deal is dead, as Gary Hart says, right, among others. We can think through this and use perhaps some of the tools of the state to maybe foreshortened ends, not to the utopian horizons of the New Left that we might have taken part in or rejected, but we still have that tinge of anti-state, anti-institutionalism that can manifest as a right neoliberalism for some, but also as a liberal neoliberalism, as Lily, you write about here, and as Paul Sabin writes about so well.
Yeah, actually, my next question was really going to build on what Dylan just mentioned, which is, one kind of common theme in a lot of the contributions, and I saw this as well in both Danielle and Nikki's pieces or chapters, was this skepticism of the untrammeled exercise of state power, right? Or cautiousness about using the state. So, I guess my question to the panel as a whole is, where does that skepticism come from? What are its roots? And then how does it shape this particular, liberal governance that you've been describing so far?
Yeah, I guess I can start because I think I'm the one that kind of poses that idea. And I discuss its particular expression in Black politics, and I kind of hinted at this in my introductory comments, but I use state skepticism to describe what I see as an impulse that is underscoring this politics of self-help and this kind of enduring preference for private sector action, for private sector driven social welfare in Black politics. And I use skeptical because the people that I'm describing, the Black professional liberals that I'm tracing, are not anti-statists. And I know that because I compare them with Black nationalists and I compare them with Black conservatives who are anti-statists. And they're constantly demanding aggressive state intervention into the structures of racial inequality. But at the same time, they have this very pragmatic awareness of the harms of the liberal state, its history of abandonment, its overt forms of violence, and its constant interventions to uphold Jim Crow capitalism. And so Black activists across the political spectrum, even those that are, working within the state apparatus by the time we get to the post-1960s, they recognize that Black folks can't rely on the state or can't depend on the state because it's the very same liberal state that has shored up white political and economic rights at the, through, not at the expense, but through the exclusion and exploitation of Black people. And so in contrast to some of the other kind of state skepticism that we see among professional class liberals, Black professional class liberal state skepticism is grounded in not this critique of the excesses of the Great Society or the inefficiencies of kind of mid-century liberalism, but instead is informed by this critique of liberalism's limitations and its violences.
And I would add that when you get to the Obama years, by that point in time, you've had like 30 to 40 years of conservative governance. And I do think that liberals, if they didn't entirely imbibe all of those critiques of government, I think they imbibed some of them. But there was also some skepticism about how well they could sell big government to the American people. And that leads to policies like in the Obama administration, this idea of nudges, that you can create sort of preferences for people, or you can push people in a certain direction without having direct government intervention. So the government is going to take this kind of paternalistic role in pointing you towards the things that they think are good for you, but they would do so in a way that was unobtrusive, so it wouldn't look like government was doing anything, and of course was very cheap because they didn't want to spend money on anything. And so I do think that the legacy of that generation of conservative governance really does play a role in the skepticism of being able to sell big government.
And one other point that I think is really important sort of historically as well, and that I think is something that, liberals after the 1970s are also grappling with in sort of the project of political memory, is just how much of the New Deal order liberal state itself was relying on structuring markets and not actually doing big public delivery of public goods, with the exceptions of things like, confiscatory top marginal tax rates and Social Security and certain sort of regulatory features. So much of how the New Deal state worked was by ensuring markets, by working through private intermediaries, right? You think about the Cold War military Keynesian state as a sort of classic example of that. And so part of the difficulty that, post 1960s liberals and conservatives have is that when you, and this is, what Musk and Trump are facing right now, is that so much of what, when we talk about limiting big government, what we're limiting are expenditures that work through private or subnational intermediaries. And so that makes for a sort of shadowboxing political climate where you can see on the page that government spends a lot of money, that there are a lot of grant officers and supervisors, as Stephen Massacara's chapter shows, of like contractors, right? But the state itself sort of kind of is there and isn't there, right? And so that makes for this sort of spiraling anti-statist, like hyper privatization rhetoric, when that was often how the liberal state functioned historically. And so I think that also makes it very difficult for liberals to point to moments of robust public sector action in the past, right? I've written about Bill Clinton's, pretty dramatic calls for industrial policy in the early 1990s, and the best he could come up with was the highway system as a sort of precedent for what he was trying to do. And so I think that's another piece of this, is that, there's a deeper continuity that has made the political imagination far narrower than it might otherwise be.
Well, I'll just build, I mean, not to make everything sort of hyper presentist, but I do think there's a way of reckoning with the fact that liberals have contributed to this version of state skepticism for a number of different reasons, but like not just blaming this on all of a sudden Elon Musk and Donald Trump are coming in and doing this. And it is a continuous narrative, and that part and parcel of this particular version of professional class liberalism was that piece, which had a lot of sort of dominance in the 1990s and beyond, and the Obama administration. And you can see it like that. I mean, the whole idea, but I think the really interesting question is like there is the thing of like, you need to have technical savvy to do these things, but also the idea of like, we're going to use market approaches to make government more efficient at the same time. So it's like there's an interesting duality there, but that is much more of a sort of continuity story than I think it is a break of what's happening right now.
Great. So I have plenty more questions, but I'm seeing my questions echoed in the Q&A. So I'm going to, given the time we have left, I'm going to pivot to those. So the first comes from Patrick Rose, who asks, is professional class liberalism necessarily a form of neoliberalism, given the evolution of the global capitalist economy after the 1970s, Bretton Woods, free trade, GATT, et cetera? And yeah, we might broaden the question in general, give it a historiographic spin. Is like, what do you see this volume as speaking to or differentiating from histories of neoliberalism?
I can take a stab at that to start. I don't think that professional class liberalism is necessarily a component of neoliberalism. I think that we try to sort of lay that out in the introduction. I think in any governing apparatus as complex and as ambitious as the U.S. state continues to be, you're going to need these types of publicly spirited, well-trained experts, right? But I think where you see these parallels in Western Europe and other sort of developed nations is that as the ranks of these professionally trained experts have emerged, what you've seen is a sort of simultaneous winnowing of the political imagination and among liberals. But I also think that is also part and parcel, as Dylan shows very clearly in his chapter, of the sort of class composition as well, of the institutions that they're a part of. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's got to be a part of a neoliberal project, but it means that those institutions that they're a part of need to be subordinated within a broader sort of moral and social political vision. And so I don't think we're going to get rid of professional class liberals. Musk and Trump are certainly trying to do it. But I would hope that we could attach their mastery to a much more robust social vision. Dylan, it looks like you've got something.
Yeah, I think we could highlight the shifting political economy that undergirds this. That doesn't necessarily mean a shift to neoliberalism, but the decline of unions and the institution that was the backbone of the Democratic Party, we should just surface that, is essential here, right? This kind of the Fordist model of unionized employees who were psychically aligned with liberalism as much as institutionally, were deeply embedded in these institutions that mobilized them and created a common project. Like that does decline, whether we want to, that is an aspect of the post-industrial transformation that we're tracking, maybe always not explicitly, but it's in the background. And in its stead, there are new forms of flexible accumulation, you might want to say, financialized production. Philanthropy takes an increasing role, as we have a chapter in the book about that. The journalists I'm writing about are these flexible workplaces where no one is in the union, right? No one has health insurance. It's very precarious. And so we can track the evolution of the institutions that undergirded the liberal coalition and their decline. That might be a kind of parallel story to neoliberalism. It's certainly related, but it is not the totality of that transformation. But the political economy shift is in all these chapters, implicitly or explicitly.
And just to put a fine point on that point that you're making there, Dylan, I think, and Simon referenced at the start, that sort of hoteling flexible workplaces, that's part of a broader project of sort of socially disembedding and fragmenting people, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that you couldn't unionize a white collar workplace, right? But under the sort of terms of WeWork and flexible spaces, that becomes increasingly hard, right? And that's a question of capital, political economy, management, right? Not necessarily that you were just trained as a lawyer,
And those unions themselves are subject to those same forces. So the SEIU, which had been a largely Black and Latino and woman-led union in the early years of Obama's presidency, is taken over by white professional class organizers. And it changes the tenor of the union, and it changes how the union functions and the sort of organizing and connections that are underneath it. And I think that too, sort of like, you have some unionization happening, but it is also subject to the forces of professionalization that fracture some of the community ties that were so important to making it a strong union to begin with.
Great, thank you. So we have an anonymous question, which I think is probably stating what a lot of people in the audience are thinking, which is, as Trump and Musk deconstruct the administrative state, the moral and political science of democratic liberals is deafening. Do you see any resources that contemporary liberalism can bring to the crisis? And I know historians don't like predicting the future, but maybe I might add to that and say, how does this history shape the maybe constraints and possibilities of liberalism as it's responding or perhaps not responding to this moment?
Well, I was going to say this is a slightly tangential answer, but I think hopefully gets there. So when Kamala Harris announced that Tim Walz was going to be the vice presidential choice, Brent texted me, is like, is our volume doomed? Like, what does this mean? So I think there's a way of like the fact that like and like ultimately it only proved it further because they didn't actually utilize any of Walz's populist abilities in terms of the campaign. But I was thinking, like, to me, the Harris campaign like so perfectly personifies so many of the kinds of dimensions of our volume and like what we've been describing, of the kinds of ways that a lot of these ideas come to shape both the Democrats and liberals, both politically, but in terms of their approach to policy. And so the hope, I mean, in some ways, is that this actually becomes like a reckoning in some capacity to sort of, on the one hand, to think about what are the limitations of this approach to kind of approach, but at the same time also then like thinking about what the state is and can do. I mean, I think there's a way of like, how do we continue to have certain forms of state skepticism, but also like think about the Democratic Party's long and liberalism's long tradition of governance. And so like this is a first step of sort of opening up that kind of conversation. And our hope is that we can kind of the variances of this volume help to kind of think about it in different ways.
I want to add too, I think one of the other things, sort of thinking about the arc from the sort of 60s to today, I mean, I think, and this is something that actually Gabe Wynant charts in his conclusion a little bit, is that both sort of in how historians studied politics, but also how liberals thought about politics from the 70s forward, was a very state-centered approach, right? Rather than organizing, mass publics to go protest somewhere and maybe get arrested, you would get, as Sarah Milov and Rule Schiller's chapter shows, you'd organize a public interest law shop and you would sue the bastards, right? Or you would get hired by the regulatory agency, right? So there was a very internalist idea about political change that made the state primary, both in how sort of scholars were thinking about political change, but I think also a whole lot of liberals, right? And so voting was enough as long as you got the people in there. They would design the right policy. They would, tweak things correctly. And one of the things I'm actually really puzzled by with Hakeem Jeffries and some of these others, basically saying like our hands are tied, is like, where is their technical mastery of the rules of Congress and Senate? Where is the intricate knowledge of like how we can actually use the institutional choke points and leverage to slow things down? Like where is that, even an internal mode of struggle is sort of in absence right now. And so that to me is, shows the sort of the complete, political and moral, vacuousness of where this has led. And so we're gonna have to do it ourselves.
It also strikes me that the contemporary Democratic Party is just locked into the logics of an earlier era of politics that they cannot escape. These appeals to work with the Republican administration harkens back to that era when bipartisanship was the best possible thing that you could do. This institutionalism that kept the Democratic Party from moving more boldly in the last 4 years. Like it does seem like the older version of liberal politics is acting as handcuffs for the current Democratic Party in a way that not only are they going to have to shed those commitments in order to move forward, but as the administrative state is deconstructed, they're also going to have to become visionaries. Like you're going to have to sell a new vision, because it's not just going to be enough to hire back a bunch of people. Like if state capacity has been fundamentally destroyed, it's not enough to just try to breathe life into institutions created in the 1930s. They're going to have to go back to the drawing board. And so that lack of a moral vision and political vision that we've been talking about tonight, we're feeling it especially keenly now at a moment that we need it the most.
Thanks so much. Okay, one final question. We don't have a huge amount of time, but we can go over a minute or two. So Alexia Hudson Ward asks, I believe that at one time in history, being part of the educated professional class was an American aspiration embraced by many. What do you believe was the tipping point that shifted this aspiration into a source of vitriol and a borderline slur among working class Americans? In other words, why did it become such a bad thing to be a professional class liberal? And why have political majorities emerged in rejection of them?
Well, for one thing, there's been a 75-year campaign against higher education from the right that has been pretty effective because it's been amplified through politicians and through their own media. And that's a big part of it.
And I'll add two quick things there. I mean, I think one, it's important to note that sort of anti-intellectualism itself is deeply American, right? Richard Hofstadter wrote a whole book about it 75 years ago or so. But I think the second piece too is goes back to the sort of institutional question, and the rising costs of higher education are really significant. The way that mid-century liberals in the Johnson administration decided that rather than directly publicly subsidizing the cost of tuition, we're going to structure a debt market for people to borrow to go to college, right? And so it's not simply that people are anti-higher ed, it's that the bar to higher ed has become higher and higher and higher, while the economy no longer rewards all of the kinds of employment that you might want to do with your degree in higher ed. And so I think that's a sort of structural story that the people who lead these universities, the people who created these debt markets, sort of, again, were really out of touch with how people were perceiving and experiencing these structures.
Well, and I think too, like the faith of this particular version of professional class liberals in their own project, who are all people who, who all benefited from it in various different capacities. So that's what you like reproduce. It becomes really problematic. And I think the idea, we don't really talk about this in the volume, but it's something that I've studied elsewhere, is this the Democrat and liberal obsession with jobs retraining, and this idea that you can basically restructure the entire economy, and then you can bring magically people are going to go to a community college and they'll have the ability to suddenly they'll have these new jobs. I think that just got
code.
They'll learn to code, and exactly just everyone's gonna become a coder. And I think that that might have sold a little bit in the 90s, but by this moment is just not a feasible message. And so that's part of the issue too, that this faith in educate this faith of education is just falling really short on all of these fronts. But I do think that idea that you can just offshore jobs and all of a sudden these new ones will reappear is just a really false message.
And I do want to indict liberals even more. I think there is a shred of truth in the critiques from the right. They're done in terrible faith often, and they're loaded with anti-feminist, racist baggage, right? But there is, in fact, a new class that does arise in the wake of the post-industrial transformation, and they are a little bit smarmy about their self-declared superiority, right? They are winning in the new economy, and they're excited to broadcast that fact through their cultural savoir-faire, through their distinction, through their cultural habits, through what they buy, what they eat, where they live, how their houses are appointed. And that has profound cultural weight and capital that they can accrue through that. But it's limited, right? And it reflects the inequality that they're enjoying as they sit atop the economic pyramid that's financialized, that is weighted towards professionals. It's then manifested, displayed, broadcast through cultural expression that are then become targets of derision from those who are left out of that border, right? Whether that there's a complicated Freudian thing going on about the disavowal of those things as people simultaneously lust for it, we can wonder. But there is something going on there, right? The anti-liberalism of, say, a blue-collar conservatism, reaction to a real shred of kind of self-superior smarm that we can anatomize and joke about, but I think is real because these people do love their credentials and they have worked quite hard to secure their brownstone in a gentrified neighborhood, and they do shop locally and they feel good about it. And those aren't things necessarily that are politically harmful, but they've set themselves up for critique from conservatives who actually are more anti-liberal than they are conservative. Someone poking fun at political correctness becomes a cottage industry, and it has profound political implications for those who they find power in that transgressive discourse. And that becomes a whole flag to, march on the Capitol with.
And stay tuned for Dylan's book on yuppies coming to a bookstore near you next year.
Thank you, Brent.
Well, on that note, we are at time. So I just want to thank Unpopular Boston Review, all the panelists for a great discussion. It was really interesting. Mastery and Drift is, I think, out now, right? Correct? Yes. And yeah, so thanks everyone. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.